All right, I think we are ready to go, Alex. Thank you, everybody, for your patience. We apologize for those issues. Alex, if you can maybe get started from the beginning again. Let me just give me a quick second here. I just want to make sure we're all good to go. So Alex, please go ahead and get started.
Sure, let me take things from the top, and thank you to everybody for sticking with us through these technical issues. So let me just reiterate my thanks to the Zappi Group for inviting me to play this role at this really important conference. So what I'm speaking about is the power of electrification. And many of you might think, well, why do we need to talk about this topic? We're all in electrification. We all understand the power that this technology has. But what I hope to provide is an outsider's perspective. So it may well be that because you're inside electrification, some of the huge types of power might not actually be obvious from an insider's perspective. So what I like to bring as an outsider's perspective, as somebody who's worked in sustainable finance for about 15 years, and also provide some insights as to how to unleash this power and how to unleash this potential. So why is electrification so powerful? Because it has the power to solve the most urgent problem facing the world today, and that is climate change. Now, you might think, well, climate change, people have been speaking about this for 30 years. When I was at school, we understood the importance of global warming. But now we finally seem to see coordinated action to this problem, and therefore right now something like electrification, which could be a solution, that is something which is even more important. And so this coordination is at many levels. So first, governments are taking action. So they're not just making some empty promises, they're making legally binding climate agreements. For example, the European climate law, that's across many countries to be carbon neutral by 2050. Now, you might well think that's a long way off, but they have some intermediate targets. So by 2030, they intend to reduce greenhouse gases by more than 50% compared to 40 years ago. And there might be some countries which make some claims, and you might think, well, even if those claims seem to be legally binding in the letter of the law, who's actually going to enforce this? Because these countries are so powerful, you can't do anything about it. But even for these countries, it may well be that they will adhere to their commitments because of national pride. So China, for example, they're one of the world's biggest polluters, perhaps the biggest polluter. And people will think, yes, will they really go off coal when this is employing millions of people? But throughout history, China has a track record of using industrial policy to forge leadership positions in key technologies. So one might think, even if China is not really concerned about global warming from a social or environmental perspective, they may well care about it from a technological and national pride perspective. Let's take a leadership position in something which will be really important. Now, obviously, it's not just governments that matter in this question. Companies matter, and companies themselves are taking action. So CEO pay is increasingly linked to climate, not just issues such as stock price. They're putting in the C-suite chief sustainability officers, so people at the highest level of a company who are responsible for sustainability firm-wide. What they're disclosing is not just their quarterly earnings and their balance sheet and their cash flow statement, but they're disclosing scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So that might be direct emissions, purchased electricity, and also downstream emissions. And why might companies be doing this? Well, a lot is due to investor pressure. Now, people have historically said, well, investors, why would they care about climate change? Don't investors want to extract as much dividends as possible? But this is not the case. You can see many investors committing to invest in net zero portfolios, such as the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative. Again, you might think, well, a commitment, who's going to enforce this? But when investors are unable to adhere to their commitments, or when they leave some alliances like Vanguard, there's significant negative public relations. We've seen where this commitment translates. So what they're doing is sometimes they're engaging with companies, a famous example being engine number 1, which got 3 climate-friendly directors elected to Exxon's board. And then in terms of valuations, how do they actually affect the valuation of a company? They're incorporating climate into the cost of capital and into the cash flows. So whether or not investors are willing to buy shares in the company or dump their shares depends on climate considerations. And there's also policymakers beyond national governments. There's, in the EU, for example, various alphabet soups of different types of legislation to make sure that this matters. Well, you might think, okay, yes, we can see climate action, but climate action, that need not mean electrification, because aren't there other solutions to global warming than electrification? One very popular solution is degrowth, and this is something that people are taking seriously. There have been some books and policymakers running on a degrowth platform. So what is this? If we just consume less, if we travel less, we won't pollute as much, and therefore that will ensure that we do not cross these planetary boundaries. But there's many problems with this, which is why I don't think degrowth will be seen as one of the major solutions to this problem. It might condemn entire countries or regions to poverty. So if we're going to ban non-essential air travel, then many developing countries that rely on tourism, they will be suffering huge losses of jobs. And also countries like the UK and the US, we benefited from the Industrial Revolution, which was hugely polluting. If we are going to stop other countries from industrializing, then this will be hypocritical on the part of developed countries like the UK and the US. There's a huge say-do gap. If you poll people, particularly millennials, on whether they will consume less, they will say so, when often you might see them to be one of the big consumers of things like fast fashion and air travel. And also, even when we think about essential industries, not luxury industries, many of them are highly energy intensive. So some of you will know this great book by Václav Smil, How the World Really Works, where he takes some of the key industries like ammonia, which we need for food production, like concrete, all of them require a lot of energy. This whole idea that we are going to reduce our energy consumption, that is not so realistic. We have this nice idea of carbon offsets, which seems great, right? We can keep polluting as much as we are right now and then pay somebody to stop trees being shut down or to plant new trees. That sounds great, but the true impact is often unclear and it's often temporary. So it may well be that you stop a tree being cut down temporarily, but then a few years later it is felled. Or maybe you plant a new tree, but you don't know how long that tree is going to be alive for. Well, one simple solution is clean energy. So there's wind, there's solar, that excites people. But clean energy itself, that's insufficient if many applications don't use electricity. So we keep thinking in the UK or in the US, what happens if the electricity grid goes green? Well, then we can use clean energy. But if many applications are not electric, then it doesn't really matter whether the grid is green or not. We are not really using electricity. And so this, to me, is why electrification is such a compelling solution. Yes, there are already other solutions out there, but they either have huge trade-offs which make them unworkable, or they are solutions which don't really work in a permanent way, or they don't work unless it's in combination with electrification. And yet, despite this being so powerful and so important, unfortunately, it does not dominate the debate among policymakers, the debate among companies and investors as much as we would like. Yes, we think of these grand projects like wind energy, solar energy, hydrogen planes. And if you're a government, you want to put a lot of effort behind this because you might think if we're funding something like hydrogen planes, we will get a technological edge. We can demonstrate to our electorate how serious we are and how ambitious we are. But smaller projects, which might seem smaller scale individually, but if done many, many times, they could have huge impact. Those smaller projects are often a bit left by the wayside. And this is what I see as an outsider to be many of the initiatives that electrification can bring. For example, to develop high-frequency battery chargers, that is hugely enabling because this allows electrification, it allows it to be efficient, it allows it to be practical and realistic. But we see this often absent from the debate. So this is why it's such a pleasure for me as a proponent of sustainable finance to address this audience, because I believe you have the power to solve the world's greatest challenge without some of these concerns that we see right now. And often this is a huge power which is overlooked when we think about what are the projects which are getting a lot of attention and government funding and investors behind it. Electrification has huge power, but this might not necessarily be recognized. So how would an economist like me view electrification? So if you're a company thinking of developing a high-frequency battery charger, what would you do? Well, what you would do is you would do a financial calculation. As you can guess, I really had fun designing this slide. So what is this slide? This says, as an economist, if you were to think about building these high-frequency battery chargers, you would project all of the future cash flows of that project in year 1, in year 7, in year 38, in year 49, right until the end of time. And if electrification is expensive in the first few years because a huge amount of investment is required, and if maybe you don't think the cash flows will be positive for maybe 10 years, perhaps because you think government action will take time to manifest, it will still be that this is something justified by a calculation. Why? Because the future prospects of this are so positive that even if there's a short-term interim cost, we will still go ahead with electrification. But that's what happens in theory. Well, in theory, you solve equations like this, and this is how finance people like me will justify an electrification project. Does it work in practice? Well, I have to admit that sometimes it does work in practice. So sometimes these calculations do work. So if you were a car company and thinking about, would I want to develop something like electric cars? Well, the answer is yes. Even if I don't care at all about climate change, even if I ignore the social problems I discussed in the first 5 minutes, I will still build an electric car factory. Why? Because I can do this calculation, I can project the future cash flows, and I can see the economics of electric cars are so attractive that I will want to do this for financial reasons. But what I want to stress is that most examples are not like this electric car situation. Why? Well, electric cars are something where we can absolutely see where there's a demand. We can see these already being bought, and they're being bought for high prices, and we can see that there will definitely be a market for this going forward. But there's many innovations, and you will know this far more than me by being in the industry, where we have some sense that this will create value in the future, but this value is so difficult to quantify. So many of these electrification technologies, we're not really sure how much the uptake will be. Will our clients and customers really value this? Will there be the government action in something like carbon taxes to give them the impetus to adopt this? So the idea of justifying electrification from a purely economic perspective, that makes sense in theory. It sometimes makes sense in practice for these big projects, but for the smaller projects, which are still really important, of which we might say many types of electrification fall under, maybe just looking at the financial case is not enough. So this is why what my talk is centering around is not just the financials, even though I'm a finance professor, but the purpose, the bigger picture behind electrification. So if we see electrification as a solution to such a big global problem, can that inspire us? Can that spur us? Can that lead us to being more innovative, more committed to excellence, than we might already be with a purely financial calculation. Let me repeat this. The finance, the economics behind electrification are already positive, but often just having a positive business case is not enough to cause us to innovate, because this business case is often so uncertain, is often so far in the future. So when we as companies decide to make decisions to launch a particular technology that may be risky, how can we base this on more than just the financial case? Can we think about the purpose, the mission behind this? And this involves seeing its mission behind this big social problem of climate change. So what I'm going to speak about is the power of purpose, how purpose can inspire us to go further than we might do otherwise. And let me give you some examples. And the examples I'm going to give you will be deliberately outside of electrification, because you already know that field, and this is what the rest of the conference is about. So my strength is to bring you some ideas for how purpose has driven other fields, and then you can bring that within electrification and think about, well, how can this drive innovation in your industry? So for this, I'd like to take you back 20 years to 2003. So Vodafone, which is a UK telecoms company, they noticed that in Kenya, citizens were using their phones to transfer mobile minutes to each other as a form of currency. And this gave them an idea. They thought, what if we could use our technology to allow people to transfer not just mobile minutes, but actual money? Because at the time, 15 million Kenyan adults were unbanked. They had to rely on cash, and cash could be forged, it could be lost, or it could be stolen. So if Vodafone could pull this idea off, the social impact would be huge. And indeed, 4 years later, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. And so what that does is it allows people to transfer money from phone to phone just as easily as you could send a text message today or send a photo. And importantly, you don't need a bank account to do that. So I lived in the US for 10 years. I still have a Bank of America account. It's great that I can operate this on my phone because I can't just go down to a branch. But with mobile money, you don't even need an account to begin with. And that was so important because so many Kenyans were unbanked. Now, this transformed people's lives. Within the first 7 years, it lifted 200,000 people out of poverty by giving them access to finance. And many of these households were headed up by women. It allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail, so there was a large effect on gender diversity. But the nice coda to this story is, even though this decision to launch M-Pesa was driven by purpose, it was driven by a desire to solve a big problem, financial inclusion in Kenya, ultimately, Vodafone was able to profit. Why? But it was able to charge a small percentage of every transaction. So why am I using this example? This is an example of an initiative and innovation which was motivated not through a financial calculation. It was motivated through the desire to solve a social problem of financial inclusion in Kenya. And this desire led it to coming up with this crazy idea of mobile money, of banking without a bank. And again, it decided to launch this purely based on the social case, but ultimately it became profitable and it was able to turn this into a revenue stream. Now, what I want to stress is Vodafone would have never been able to justify M-Pesa with a financial calculation. If it was to do this, the financial impact would be hugely negative. It would take a ton of investment in order to launch M-Pesa. Nobody had done it before. And even if they succeeded, well, there's huge reputational risk. What if people use it for money laundering? And even if you could overcome that, where would the money be made from serving some of the poorest people in the world? But instead, Vodafone had a purpose, and this purpose was to build a digital society that enhances socio-economic progress, and that purpose to solve the problem of financial inclusion that inspired Vodafone to launch this idea, which it might not have done otherwise. In the same way that in terms of electrification, if we see how it fits into this bigger picture, how we see how it's a solution to climate change which avoids the problems of the other solutions, can that spur us to do more than what we would have done with the business case alone? And so this is linked to an idea that was introduced in the recent book which Randall kindly mentioned, called Grow the Pie. So what is the pie? Well, we can think about the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And you can split that pie between investors in the form of profits, which is the blue, and society in the form of value, that's the orange. And that value can be fair taxes, fair wages, protection of the environment. Now, often what companies think is, well, how do I make more money? I'm going to split the pie differently. Let me take from society. Let me try to pay our workers less. Let me charge our customers more. Let's try to get away with paying less tax. But often, if you end up doing this by paying your workers less or charging your customers more, in the long term, the pie will shrink. And therefore, by trying to pursue profits directly, you might actually end up being less profitable. So the whole idea of purpose is if instead a company is driven by the idea of not increasing the blue, not making more money, but by increasing the orange, by serving society and solving social problems, what this does is it leads to companies growing the pie. So it leads them to innovate, for example, by launching something like M-Pesa. And the reason why we innovate is we want to solve a social problem, like financial inclusion in Kenya. And this desire to solve that problem leads us to doing an innovation that we might not have done otherwise. And even though that innovation is driven by the desire to increase the orange, as a byproduct of growing the pie, ultimately the blue will increase as well. And so this is the power of purpose. By driven by a social mission, if we create social value, then as a consequence, people will pay us for them. Okay, I had another example of this, but let me just skip this because of the technical issues. I want to make sure that there's time for questions at the end. So, halfway through, you might think, well, everything I've said, that sounds great. Like, electrification has potential, has power, and that power can drive us to doing things that we could not have done otherwise. But if I was to stop here, you might think, well, that's a great story, Alex, but where's the evidence? It seems a bit like wishful thinking that if we're driven by serving society, then everything will be better off. There's some karma in the world, which means that we will do better. But we can't just make business decisions based on gut feel or karma. We need to look at the hard evidence. And indeed, that is my day job as a finance professor, to ask, is what we think about and we hope to be true, is this actually true in the real world? So my job is not to tell stories, it's not even to write case studies, but it's to look across hundreds of companies, over dozens of industries, to see, is this something that holds true at large scale? So what I want to look at is it the case that purposeful companies outperform? Are companies that are driven by serving society, are these companies that ultimately become more profitable? So the big question is, well, how do you measure which companies are purposeful, which companies are driven by serving society? Now, you can't just look at a company's purpose statement, because you might say some nice things, but never put it into practice. So you might then think, well, should we look at whether a company puts its money where its mouth is? How much do they spend? How much do they give to charity? But that's not a great measure, because any sports fan among you will know that the teams that spend the most on players don't deliver the best results. So the amount of spending doesn't tell you the quality of the spending. So instead, what I want to look at is the output. How much value do you actually create for society, not how much you spend? So what I looked at was the list of the 100 best companies to work for in America, which is published every year by Fortune. So I wanted to look at how much value a company delivers to its employees. And you might think, well, why is that my definition of purpose? Didn't I just start this talk with the importance of climate change? Well, I did, but climate change might matter for some industries, but not for others. It could matter in transport and energy, but maybe it doesn't matter so much in tech. So because I wanted to look across a broad spectrum of companies, I needed to make sure that my measure of purpose was applicable to all industries. And indeed, employees are critical in nearly every sector. So what I did is I took the companies that were highest on this list and I compared them to other companies which weren't that stellar in employee satisfaction. And what I found was the 100 best companies to work for in America delivered shareholder returns that beat their peers by 2.3 to 3.8% per year over a 28-year period, which is 89 to 184% cumulative. So companies that were treating their workers well, that were serving society, they weren't just being fluffy and moral and ethical and giving pie to their workers. They were growing the pie, being more motivated, more productive, more likely to stay, and ultimately this led to higher profits for those companies. And that is why, as I alluded to earlier, why a country like China, they may well want to take technological leadership in something like electrification, not necessarily because of the social outcome, but because if you lead in something like that, you'll be financially more profitable. And what's really key here is the time period that I studied. So this 28-year period included recessions like financial crisis, September the 11th, the collapse of the internet bubble. And why is that important? People might think, okay, I've spoken so much about climate change, but right now we're getting concerns of inflation, of a recession. Will our clients really care about electrification when there's so many other problems in the world? But because this was a study which included some really bad economic conditions, it could show that this purposeful approach was something that still worked in difficult times. And indeed, the economics of this makes sense because if electrification is going to be something that reduces energy costs for some end users, that's something which is even more urgent in difficult times rather than being a luxury in difficult times. Now, there's further devil's advocate challenges you may throw at me. Is this correlation or is this causation? I seem to be suggesting if you treat your employees well, then you can perform better. But is it the flip side? Once a company's performing well, then employees are happy? Or maybe there's third factors that affect both. If you're in the tech industry, then employees are happy. And also the tech industry has done well, but there's no causality between the two. And so a lot of the work that I have to do is to tease those out and to make sure it's in this direction that I highlighted. But I'm not going to go through all of the channels through which I tease it out because I want to make sure there's enough time for the putting it into practice and there's also enough time for the Q&A. So what I've talked about is there's a huge potential for a purpose-driven company to be even more successful than one driven by profit, particularly in a pie-growing sector like electrification. So let me just drill down into how do we operationalize this. So what does it mean for a company to be purposeful? Now, often companies think it means solving every single one of the world's problems. So companies will have purpose statements like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and in communities and investors. Well, that sounds fantastic, but it's unrealistic. You can't serve everybody. For example, some great innovations which involve automation, that might actually be good for the environment, but it might be bad for workers because there might end up being job losses. For example, if we have something like mobile banking, that's fantastic for the environment. We don't need to have physical bank branches, but obviously we're not going to have as much employment. And indeed, I don't think this is what purpose is about. If we think about the word purpose in the English language, purpose does not mean altruism. It means focus. A purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So I define purpose as why a company exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role that it plays in the world. And that might seem a bit lofty and idealistic, but what I want to highlight with this is purpose must be focused. Right? We can't be all things to all people. We can't solve all 17 sustainable development goals. Instead, our goal as a company might be to solve a couple in a really, really efficient way. Let's focus on the 2 or 3 that we can really move the needle. So something like electrification, which has such power to create a lot of value in terms of the solution to climate change, there might be side effects in terms of employment, and those side effects are not to be taken lightly. However, that might not be for your companies to solve. Your goal is to be as innovative and as creative and as bold as possible with electrification technology. It's perhaps the government's responsibility or other people's responsibility to deal with issues such as transitions in terms of employment. So if there's only one thing you remember from my talk, let it be this. Ask your question, what is in your hand? So what are the resources, what is the expertise that your company has, and how can you use these resources and this expertise to serve society if you think a little bit more creatively? So your responsibility is not to solve every single problem in the world, but to solve those issues which you have the power in your hand to solve. And it is true that maybe solving some problems, there might be some side effects, but you are not the only company in the world. Your goal here is to make sure that you address the issues that you are best placed to solve. There's other companies which might be best placed to solve other challenges. So with Vodafone, what was in their hand? It was a technology. And this technology historically was used to send text messages. And they thought, well, how can we redeploy this in order to instead send mobile money? So what they did directly, that did nothing for climate change, that did nothing directly for women in the workforce, at least not in Vodafone. Yet what they did was a hugely value-creating innovation to launch mobile money to address this problem of financial inclusion that it uniquely was able to solve. Let me leave you with 3 points before I get to the Q&A, and as Randall said, please do add this to the Q&A idea, and we already see a few coming in. So one thing is it means doing new things. So doing new business, thinking about new products and services, generating new innovations. And you might think, well, do we really need a purpose to do this? Even if we didn't care about climate change, even if you ignore the first 10 minutes of my talk, wouldn't I want to innovate because I can do a financial calculation and see that the innovation will be productive? But the whole thrust of my talk is, even though clearly as a finance professor I believe in the power of financial calculations, there is a limit to what we can justify using a financial spreadsheet, because some innovations are so uncertain that without this idea of purpose, we might not be inspired to pursue. So a sense of purpose can lead us to going further and faster and more boldly into thinking about some of the solutions to such a broad, big problem. But it's not just about innovation. So the second is doing the same thing in those different ways. And why do I think this is so important? Because often we think about purpose as being innovation driven, and obviously innovation matters in your sectors, but there is a limit to how innovative a company can be. Right? Vodafone does not come up with ideas like M-Pesa every day. So what I'm trying to highlight here is excellence in your core business is hugely purposeful. So I've done some work with Network Rail. So they own the rail tracks within the UK and they own some stations. And they want to be responsible to wider society. So they do things like trying to reduce graffiti on the train tracks. And there's other companies which might invest in the local community. Now that is great. But if you are a train company, maybe the best thing you can do is make sure the trains run on time. Because if you do that, that connects people with their jobs, with their friends and their family. And I think this is really important because often when we think, oh, let me be a responsible company, people think this involves doing non-core new activities. Let me launch an employee volunteer program. Let me fund some scholarships. Let me donate to charity and so on. And all of those things, those are not bad things. But in many cases, particularly for an industry like yours, which is so value creating, maybe the biggest thing that you can do is excellence in your core business. It's just like me as a finance professor, the best thing that I might do is not the fact that I bike to my lectures rather than driving, but preparing well for every lecture to make sure it's not just theoretical, but also practical. So excellence in the core business without even thinking about ancillary CSR activities. That's something which can be hugely pie growing and value generating. And finally, you can also do the same thing in exactly the same way, but recognize the purpose of what you're doing. So I'm sure some of you will know this graphic where three people are doing the same thing. One says, I'm laying bricks. The second says, I'm making a living. The third says, I'm building a cathedral. They are all doing the same thing, but one of them recognizes the higher purpose. So one company in the UK I work with is NatWest. So they are a bank. And after the lockdown was over, the CEO took her senior management team out and to a restaurant in Covent Garden, London, called the Darjeeling Express. And the owner of the restaurant gave a little talk, and she said, when I came to the UK 30 years ago, nobody believed in me. I was an immigrant, I was a woman, and banks just don't give loans to immigrant women. They're not your typical type of entrepreneur. But NatWest, you believed in me. You allowed me to start this restaurant. I've hired X numbers of staff. I've served Y thousand customers. Thank you so much for believing in me. And so if you were the NatWest employee who worked on the loan approval, you probably didn't think much of what you did. You get loads of approvals, loans come in. Some you put in the reject bin, others you put in the accept bin. You don't think much of this. But as a leader in the organization, she was able to see the power of that loan and then report it internally to her team. And there's obviously clear analogies with this with electrification. So often it may well be that the engineers who work on this, or maybe a procurement department, which allows the company to get the resources to produce these innovations and in an efficient manner, you might not see how this fits into the system. So how then this jives with other solutions to climate change to address this huge issue, how without electrification, something like wind power or making the grid go green alone will be insufficient. So often as senior people in the organization, seeing these great stories, seeing the power of the products and services that you do, can you just translate that internally into the team and into the employees who work on them? Why? Because this gives them an even greater purpose for what they're doing and encourage them to give their best work and to be emboldened by innovation and excellence. Okay, well, thank you so much again for this opportunity to present and also to everybody for staying during the technical issues. As I mentioned, part of this is based on a recent book, which I write this book to highlight how this idea of purpose of serving society is not just fluffy. It's not just about saving the dolphins. Those are important things, but it's about being efficient, effective, innovative, and ultimately being good for business. Okay, so let me end here and hand to Randall to go through the Q&A. Thank you for those who've already shared some questions, and please keep them coming. Yeah, I'm certainly happy to chat about that, Randall, but also there's a few questions which were sent to me privately, so you might not see them. So I'll read them out and I might get to them as well after the question. Okay, so what's the biggest pushback? I actually don't really see much of a pushback to my ideas because, as the question asker kindly suggested, these ideas are logical, right? If you create value for society, you do benefit. Society is willing to pay you a part of that value. Instead, I think what I suffer most from is not push back, but lack of push forward. In that, my ideas tend to be a bit middle of the road. So I'm saying serving society is important, but it's also important to be profitable. So there's some who might say, oh, let's only think about solving climate change. Don't think about profits. Companies should just stop growing and so on. But I just don't think that's realistic for the reasons I mentioned at the start. And then you have people at the other end of the political spectrum saying, oh, companies should only make money. All of these things about climate, they're completely woke. So because I'm somewhat in the middle, there are ways in which companies can serve society. And hey, by the way, this is profitable. This is not just about being worthy. That's something where I'm going to have neither people on either extreme being a huge supporter. But my goal is not to get support from only one end. It's to try to find solutions that work for both business and society. And this is why, to me, the politicization of ESG in the US that I see, at least from an outsider, seems a bit odd. Because some Republicans say, well, ESG, that's a distraction. But if it's a way to make businesses more successful and more innovative and more profitable in the long term, that is something that every Republican should be wanting to embrace.
Wonderful. That's great. Let me just come to another one here as well for you, Alex. So with all of that you've talked about, why do companies just not get it? Like, what are the obstacles there?
I think this is linked to a question that I got privately, which says, Alex, what kind of big levers work effectively to push companies to look to the long term? And I think this is why I think many companies just don't actually deliver on this, is that this idea of growing the pie, that makes sense, but it's only true in the long term. So in the short term, the pie is fixed. And if I go back to the pie diagrams earlier, I know that I'll need to display them again. In the short term, the best way in order to generate profit is just to split the pie. And so this is why you see companies in both the UK and in the US trying to do things like paying their workers less or overcharging to customers. And in the long term, it's true that the pie will shrink, but it may well be that the CEO is paid according to quarterly earnings, or investors are evaluating the CEO according to the quarterly stock price. So to the question that I got sent to me privately, the big levers, I think one of the most important levers is to tie the CEO's pay to the long term. Now, that seems an obvious solution. So to Randall's question, why aren't people doing it? Well, when people focus on pay, they focus on the level of pay or the ratio of CEO pay to worker pay. So I believe the SEC in the US has required this to be disclosed since 2018. So the whole idea is we want the CEO to be paid fairly. Fair pay must mean that she is not getting too much more than everybody else. But that's all based on the pie splitting idea. If there's a fixed pie, then the only way you can make everybody better off is by making the CEO worse off by paying her less. But my argument is if you make the CEO aligned with the long term, then she will have incentives to grow the pie to innovate, and that growing the pie will benefit not only the company and not only the CEO, but also the workers and the other stakeholders of the business. And so what does it practically mean to give the CEO long-term incentives? So number one is you're often giving CEOs shares in their own company, but saying you're not allowed to sell these shares for maybe 5 or 7 years. For example, in Exxon, I believe, half of the CEO's equity cannot be sold for 10 years, the other half for 5 years. And that is an important long-term horizon for something as critical as decarbonisation. In some cases, the CEO has to keep holding his or her shares after they've retired. And why is that important? Because often the problems that we're trying to solve will outlast a CEO's tenure. So CEOs in particular in the US, their tenures are quite short. Sometimes they might not look beyond 3 or 4 years out, but the challenges that I've discussed, those are challenges which will take far longer to solve, and so long-term equity will address that.
That's great. Wonderful, Alex. So just maybe one final thought here, and I think you covered it really well when you talked about purpose, but what are just some very just effective starting points for companies in your mind? Maybe if you could summarize that for us.
Yes, so I think one, and I will be biased in this because I'm a finance professor, is the power of data and evidence. Because when we think about purpose, people think, oh, that's fluffy, it's all about coming together in a circle and singing Kumbaya. But it's not. Why I can be so passionate about purpose, even though I'm a finance professor, not a philosopher, and I'm an ex-investment banker, as you remember from my bio, I was at Morgan Stanley, I understand the importance of making money, but why I can be so passionate about purpose is it is something that leads us to making money in the long term. So looking at that evidence and data suggests that it's not something which is just purely woke or tree huggy. And I think this is, to your first question, your last question, Randall, another reason why companies don't get it. The pie splitting mentality is ingrained in us from a young age, right? If we play any game, we win by making the other person lose. If we play Monopoly, how do we win? We bankrupt our opponent, right? It's a zero-sum game. But we need to relearn this and look at the evidence which suggests that business is a positive-sum game. So I think that's number one. Just look at the evidence that the pie can be grown, that we can have win-wins. Number two will be the long-term incentives and the long-term mindset that the last person who emailed me the question privately highlighted. And number three is, I think, for companies to ask themselves what is in our hand and say, well, what are the things that I have the power to solve as my company? What for you is the equivalent of M-Pesa, where you have this technology which is not being used? And so I've even asked this for myself, like, what's my job as a finance professor? My job as a finance professor is to teach things like the weighted average cost of capital, and it's to teach things like net present value analysis. So if this is the case, what should my class involve? It should involve just doing this all the time. But is this really going to transform the lives of my students? Well, probably not. So what I'm realizing in 2023 is one really important skill in the modern world is public speaking. And so that's something that I have a lot of experience with through things like my TED and TEDx talks. So even though my job is purely to teach finance, in my course I will have the significant public speaking element. In the same way that Vodafone's job was to provide text messages and telephony, but it decided instead to do something like mobile money. So again, think about how you can go above and beyond by using the expertise that you have. And then let me add just one fourth thing. I know normally you should stop with 3 points, but I think this fourth thing is really important as well, is to think about what should I stop doing? Right, so purpose is about what to do more of, but time and resources are limited, and you can only do more of something if you do less of something else. So going back to my idea that purpose is not about solving every single problem in the world, for me, the only way I'm able to select more time to doing things like public speaking, more time in terms of interacting with companies, is if I spend less time on other things. So I have to admit, I don't really contribute much to the PhD program at London Business School. That's something which is purely academic. My colleagues who are pure academics, they are much better at that than me. I like to spend time with practitioners. It's a pleasure for me to do webinars like this. And suddenly for a company, if you're going to double down in some of the most innovative solutions to these problems out there, well, does that mean that you have to cut back on some other things? And those other things might be great things, like let's help deforestation within our local community. Let's help paint a school, which I used to do when I was at Morgan Stanley. Maybe those things are things that you might need to cut down on in order to double down on electrification. So if purpose is to have any meaning, what will it drive you to do? But what are the things that you might stop doing, even though those things might seem worthy?
Thank you so much, Alex. Listen, we really appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your contribution to today's session and conversation. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Again, apologies for the audio issues at the beginning of the session. You can feel free to go back and watch the recorded session, which will be available shortly. Please do join the other sessions, which are getting started shortly. And thank you very much again, Alex, for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much, Randall. Thank you to the Zappy group for inviting me, and thank you for everybody for giving up an hour to hear my thoughts on this topic. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.